Okay, so we're going to talk about schizophrenia today, which is one of the major psychotic disorders. We've all heard about it, and schizophrenia, sort of when we think about that crazy person, schizophrenia is the most likely diagnosis to fit what we mean by crazy. So, obviously, crazy is not a diagnosis. Crazy usually refers to somebody who's not quite in touch with reality, who doesn't make sense a lot of the times, maybe even has delusions or paranoia. And so there's other disorders that easily could fall under what we mean by crazy. Um, Bipolar can have its moments of hallucinations and delusions, and mania often doesn't make sense. Depression can have these sorts of delusions, but schizophrenia is probably the most classic one of what we mean by someone who is crazy. Although, having said that, people with schizophrenia can function really well in society. Just because you have schizophrenia does not mean that you're crazy. It does not mean that you are out of touch with reality or delusional or actively hallucinating. But it means that you have a biological as well as a psychological um, propensity, likelihood of something like that happening. Some people with schizophrenia can be actively schizophrenic and they can still cope with it really well. And there is a whole continuum of mild to severe symptoms that that could make it something very difficult to live with, or it could make it something that the person can easily cope with. With a good support network, medications, and so on also help. Now, like depression, schizophrenia is one of those words that just gets thrown around. People use the term schizophrenia in all sorts of ways that has no resemblance to what the word schizophrenia actually means. Like, oh, I'm having such a schizophrenic day. I woke up and I was grumpy, and then as soon as I walked out, my roommate said, "Hey, your tax return came in." And I was so happy, and then I went into school, and there's a car crash on the way, so I was late. And, it just sort of refers to, um, crazy extremes in life, which is not schizophrenic at all. So, that's one of the problems is that we have to define these words, like depression. When you say you're depressed, you don't really mean clinical major depression. When you say, oh, that guy's so schizophrenic, what you're meaning is he's weird, he doesn't make sense, sort of capturing some of the characteristics of schizophrenia, but not the whole disorder whatsoever. Now, one of the most fundamental aspects of schizophrenia is it's a disorder of communication where they don't communicate very well, and that's fundamentally is what the disease is difficulty communicating. But it's more than that, of course. It's disease of thought. It's a thought disorder, a disorder of inappropriate emotion, inappropriate attribution. And what you'll see is it's not just some sort of generic craziness. It doesn't mean crazy. It's not just some crazy. There are typical structures to the ways structures that aren't working right in schizophrenic, which we'll talk about. And part of what brings this across is the obvious fact that there is no way that schizophrenia is just one disease. There's all sorts of subtypes. You have a subtype of paranoid schizophrenia, which is where people think they're out there to get them and they have a sense of persecution. You have catatonic schizophrenia, where the person is in a frozen state and they can't move for long periods of time. You have schizoaffective disorders, which aren't technically schizophrenia. They're a mixture of schizophrenia and depression disorders. And it's not just one disease. There are a whole array of behavioral symptoms we're going to look at. Some of them are more common in certain subtypes. So this is just going to be a broad overpass to begin to make sense of the disease. And above all else, it's a disease of cognitive abnormalities, of abnormal sequential thought. They're not thinking how we are. It's a abnormal sequential thought is a term. The term that is given for it is loose associations. So you may have learned about Freud and his idea of free association. So when he is trying to get into what's down deep in your subconscious mind, he will, ask you to just say whatever words come into your mind. Just freely associate. You say one word, it's associated with another, and just whatever comes up. So schizophrenics have loose association, and we'll talk more about that in a while. I'm going to show you a video too where it will give you, you'll see the loose association very easily. So we can all, tell a story, and we have a pretty good ability to put it sequentially, give the facts in a way that it makes sense to the listener. You do not see this in schizophrenics. That's the loose association part. So sequential thinking is greatly impaired. And instead of having logical sequences of information, they give things all over the place, and these tangents that just don't make sense. They're bouncing all around. And when you look back at it, you can kind of see how they might have gotten to where they were, but they sort of go from A to Z in a way where, a normal person would have gone A, B, C, D, E, F, and eventually gotten to Z, and they just skip right over to it. So you get schizophrenics, for example, who get terribly confused in a sentence where they are hearing about boxers, and they're unable to keep it straight whether they're talking about a human boxer or a dog boxer. And so they'll slip back and forth between the two. So, they might start talking about a caddy carrying golf clubs, and then they end up talking about a Cadillac. And so they can't hold this sequential logic, and instead they have these tangents, and they get caught up in these loose associations, and they can't keep it straight. You're talking about a boxer, Muhammad Ali, and all of a sudden, if you're schizophrenic, you might be talking about Muhammad Ali fighting against the St. Bernard in the ring, and you're like, how did you get to that point? But it makes sense in a way where, you've got Muhammad Ali is a boxer, a dog is a boxer, Muhammad Ali fighting another dog like a St. Bernard. So it makes sense in a way looking back at it, but the jump is so extreme, and it's like, it's not what we were talking about. How did you get there? And so when you're talking to schizophrenics, oftentimes you'll feel like you're having a normal conversation, but you're just really confused. And you'll see it on people's faces too. There's a video I'm going to show. I might have to post it. I don't know if it's somebody else's video on YouTube, so sometimes copyright issues. But if not, if I can't include it in this, I'll post it. And it's a conversation with a schizophrenic. And the conversation sort of makes sense, but you see the interviewer's face the whole time. It's just like this, just like, okay, trying to get to the point, trying to understand, just this sense of mild confusion during the whole conversation. And that's a classic sign of talking to somebody with schizophrenia, because they have this loose association, and they get caught up in it. Between the sound of the word, its multiple meanings, and it just gets them off track so that they can't be consistent. They have a lot of trouble with abstract thought and abstractions. All of us have a pretty good intuition of when someone's telling a story. It's meant to be a literal reporting of events. It's supposed to make sense in a sequential way. Maybe it's supposed to be metaphorical, but we understand which one it is, and we can stay on track with it. If it's a metaphor, you stay with a metaphor. If it's concrete, you stay with a concrete story. And schizophrenics are terrible at that. They have no intuition of the right level of abstraction. That's just gone. That's the biggest thing. And they tend to interpret things more concrete if it's meant to be abstract. And that's the term used in the business, is concreteness of thought, which is having a lot of trouble doing the more abstract process of seeing things on like a metaphorical level, things of that sort. So here's the standard test I would give to someone if you think they're schizophrenic. You give them an association task, and you say something like, okay, can you tell me what do these things have in common? An apple, an orange, and a banana. And they'll say all sorts of things. They're multisyllabic words. You'll say, okay, well, great, that's true, but anything else they have in common? And all of them have letters that involve closed loops. And so they're getting caught up in the concreteness of these words, and the interpretations of it, and they can't step back and look at the abstraction of it, which is that they're all fruit. They see it in all these different concrete ways. So, a therapist meets a patient and says something like, "What's on your mind today?" And they'll say, "My hair is on my mind," because very literally their hair is on their mind. Or you'll say, "Can I take your picture?" And they say, "I don't have a picture to give you," which is very literal. One of the classic types of tests that's done is called proverb tests. And proverbs, by definition, they're metaphorical, they're very abstract, they're parables. And we all know intuitively that when you're talking about birds of a feather flock together, you're doing something symbolic about the well-known homogeny, similarity of people who, you choose to marry or to hang out with, and that they're all similar. Yes, birds of a feather flock together. It's talking about, who we tend to assort with. So anyhow, give this proverb to schizophrenics, and they can't get out of the most concrete level of interpretation of it. So you're sitting down and you say, "Okay, tell me what this means. A rolling stone gathers no moss." And we all know that that's people who are on the move and doing things. They don't make emotional connections. There's a detachment. And they're often saying, stones rolling down hills. They move too fast, and it's very hard for plants to grow on them. And then the surface tends to be smooth because it's rolling. And then on top of it, if it's rolling, you've got like this angular motion to move on it, and it's very hard for moss to grow in a situation like that. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen that happen, and I've seen many stones. And on the most concrete possible level, they're incapable of pulling it back to that level of abstraction that a proverb needs. A friend of mine who's a psychiatrist came up with what has to be the all-time great proverb test for figuring if somebody has the remotest tendency of schizophrenia. So there's an abstract phrase, a proverb, that was very popular, very prevalent in the United States during World War II. It was up on posters and all the post offices, places like that. And it was a way of abstractly telling people, be careful. The information you put in letters that you're sending off to loved ones who are off at war, it could inadvertently wind up in the wrong hands and could carry information that could be extremely damaging to the U.S. You don't want, it to hurt the war effort. And of course, you probably know, loose lips sink ships. Very abstract. Try sitting down with a schizophrenic and ask them, what does it mean when you say loose lips sink ships? And suddenly there's this imagery of ships being capsized by big lips coming out of the water and things of that sort, because it can only be dealt with on the very concrete level. They can't understand the abstraction of it. Okay, what else? Delusions, beliefs in things that can't be controlled, belief in having participated in historical events that is not possible. You're sitting there interviewing a schizophrenic and they suddenly say, "Have you heard of the Great Wall of China?" And you will say, "Well, yes, in fact, I have." And they'll say, my idea, I came up with it, I planned it. The generals came to me at night with a map and I said, "This is where it goes." This is probably not what happened. A delusional thought, inserting yourself into conversations with people who no longer exist. Related to that is paranoia, which of course, paranoid schizophrenia, a frequent theme. What do apples, oranges, and bananas have in common? They're all wired for sound. If the fruit is listening to you, this makes for a rather disquieting life, and almost certainly it has something to do with if the world is making so little sense to you, if it's a world that's very threatening, a scary world, along with that, most famously perhaps with schizophrenia, is you get hallucinations. Those are the defining features of schizophrenia. Somebody is trying to figure out if somebody in an emergency room has come in with some sort of schizophrenic type disorder and hear that the person is hearing voices, and that pretty much nails down the diagnosis. There's a few other disorders that have something like hallucinations, where you're hearing things, like I said before, bipolar, when you're in the mania phase, severe depression could cause hallucinations, drug use could cause hallucinations. But if somebody comes in hallucinating or having delusions, the very first thing you're going to suspect is schizophrenia. And for reasons that are very poorly understood, The vast majority of hallucinations are auditory, so you hear them. They're very structured. They have content. They mean something. People hear voices rather than random sound. People see very structured hallucinations. They interact with them. They have relationships sufficiently so that researchers can even do studies as to which are the most common voices heard by schizophrenics. And no surprise, in Western cultures, the number one voice on the hit parade is that of Jesus. The number two voice is Satan. The number three typically is whoever is the head of state in the country at that point. It's structured to the extent that you can publish papers about what the hallucinations are like. It's that structured. Another feature of the schizophrenic symptoms is social withdrawal, not interacting with people. And schizophrenia, everybody thinks of it as a disease of abnormal thought, but it's also a disease of abnormal social affiliation, connectedness. You look at someone with schizophrenia in some village, in the Amazon rainforest, and this is going to be someone who is somewhat ostracized from the people around them, very socially disconnected, very much alone. It's not just a disease of disordered thought. More and more people are realizing the core of schizophrenia is the disordered thought. The standard view has always been to hone in on the most florid, obvious feature of the disease. Schizophrenia is the disease where you hallucinate. End of story. You hear voices. And the vast majority of neuropharmacology research that's been done on this disease is meant to go and cure the hallucinations. That's the whole goal. But it's far less responsive to any of the drugs. What is far less responsive is the tangenting, the loose associations, and that's really what people are thinking more and more is what the core of this disease is about. Couple more features, the whole world of the social withdrawal, apathy. What we're beginning to see is sort of a dichotomy in the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, which is paranoia, loose thoughts, hallucination. Positive symptoms means it's not like good, and negative is not bad in this case. It's actually saying something that is additional to normal life. Negative is something that's taken away, so it's mathematical. So people don't normally have hallucinations. That's something, unfortunately, additional. People don't normally have delusions or paranoia. That's additional. Negative, you losing something like catatonia, where you don't move, you don't talk. So you've lost normal movement. So it's a negative symptom. Negative symptoms also are the absence of social connectedness, that social withdrawal, the absence of affect or emotionally expression. They tend to be very flat with their emotional expression. Physiologically, you see some damping of the autonomic nervous system in schizophrenics. So the positive and the negative symptoms of the disease are both there, things that you have to look at. You also have to look at the notion that, of course, schizophrenia has something to do with violence. We have this idea. Everybody knows there's the scenario lurking out there of the crazy schizophrenic who's psychiatrically unstable, and they wind up doing something horribly violent, killing people. And the danger of schizophrenics, it does happen. It happens every now and then. 20 years ago, there was an incident at Berkeley where a student there who had schizophrenia probably should not have been there at all. He was very well medicated, and something cracked, and he took a bunch of Berkeley student women hostage at a bar in Berkeley and did all sorts of horrifically sexually abusive things there before he killed himself and killed a few of the female students. So when something happens like this with a schizophrenic, we automatically say, oh my gosh, these people are so dangerous. They're running around. That could happen at any second. They're like these walking time bombs. And the truth is that schizophrenics are far less dangerous than normal individuals in society. The rates of violence are extremely low. It happens, but the one exception is schizophrenics being violent and damaging themselves. There's a much higher rate of that. Self-injury is a huge feature of schizophrenia. It's part of the delusions, part of the thought disorder, part of the despair, when every now and then your head clears enough to see what the rest of your life is like. And there are even studies where the most popular places of the body that are mutilated in schizophrenics, the genitals are the top of the list, and then they go down from there. horrific things that another one is Columbia Medical School. There was an individual student there with a history of a lot of psychiatric instability and schizophrenia, and somewhat controlled with meds. And somewhere in the third year, when starting clinical rotations, with all the stressors of medical school, the person just kind of unraveled. And like I said, they probably shouldn't have been there in the first place, but nonetheless, they had a schizophrenic break. They'd withdrawn from medical school, sitting at home, paranoid schizophrenic. He had these delusions that he thought he was satanically possessed. And specifically, the way Satan was driving him to madness was obsessive sexual thoughts. So being a endocrinologist, a doctor of hormones, he thought the best way for me to get rid of this satanic possession is for me to get rid of my testosterone. So he castrated himself. But at least being well trained in endocrinology, he knew that he also had his adrenal glands, which produce a certain level of testosterone. And he proceeded to try to adrenalectomize himself, where he sterilized himself with some alcohol. He made an incision with anesthetic. He had a mirror there angled to be able to see what he was doing. And at one point he hit a blood vessel, which started bleeding, and he went to the ER at Columbia Presbyterian. And going in there, his former classmates are in there, and they're like, oh my, he's not like, oh my gosh, guys, can you help me? Look what I've done. Instead, he says, hey guys, I'm trying to take out my adrenals, and I'm having a problem with it here. Can you guys give me a hand? That is very disordered thought. This is a very elegant version of it. Schizophrenic self-injury, schizophrenic suicide. It's anything but clean. It doesn't make sense. Number 1 on the list was genitals. Number 2 for women, female schizophrenics, is breast mutilation. Number 3 is thighs, and on it goes. This brings up another feature of the disease, which is back in the 1960s when all sorts of laudable things happened along certain cultural lines. Amid that was one horrifically damaging, idiotic thing that emerged in psychiatry at the time, which was a minority view in psychiatry, a lunatic fringe view, that basically schizophrenia is not so bad. We should accept it. It's really not a bad thing. It actually has a lot of hidden blessings, making it a good thing. And soon there's this whole framework of things like schizophrenia is the disease of being healthy in a crazy world. Schizophrenia is the disease of having insights into life that other people can't. And psychiatrists at the time, one of them was a man named Ronald Lang, who became famous for this, for arguing it's not a disease. We shouldn't be medicating, we shouldn't be hospitalizing, we shouldn't be treating them. It's a bunch of blessings. And it is even continued to this day. And all you need to do is be schizophrenic or know someone who is or have a family member, and you will see there are no hidden blessings of schizophrenia. This is not a disease of hidden compensations and more insight into the world. This is one of the most horrific ways that biology can go wrong. And one of the best demonstrations of it is half of schizophrenics attempt suicide, which is a horrible statistic. And the more often you have periods of remission where you're doing well, the more likely you are to commit suicide. And what does that mean? That the more often you have periods where you're clear-headed enough to see what your life is, the more likely you are to try to kill yourself, because you see that your life is just a complete mess. So it's like you're in this world of paranoia and delusions and hallucinations, and your mind can't see how completely screwed up everything is. And then the thing with schizophrenia is every once in a while your head clears, you can think straight, and you look around and you're like, oh my gosh, what, I've got, foil covering my walls because I'm afraid of people listening in, and all of my relationships are gone, and I've alienated everybody around me, and I'm homeless on the streets. And you know that you're going to go back into this world of craziness, and it's full of despair and hopelessness, and you're guaranteed that you're going to be sucked back in at some point. And so it's very difficult. I have a friend with a brother who's schizophrenic, and it's a very difficult disease for them to live with. And every once in a while he'll just disappear, and he'll be gone for 2 years, and they'll find him on the streets, take him home, clean him up, get him on his medication, and then they know it'll happen again. It's happened over and over and over again, this cycle. So it's a disease with no hidden blessings whatsoever. it's not something that we should be embracing as acceptable. I mean, not that we should treat schizophrenics bad, but it's doing them a disservice to say we should just accept people the way they are. Like, you know, if you have gangrene in your leg, we shouldn't just accept you the way that nature made you, because your leg is rotting off and it's going to kill you. There are things out there that it's okay to say this is not a good thing and we need to help this person. So don't get caught up in the whole political correct mindset that we shouldn't judge and we shouldn't say anything's bad, because there are some things that are bad out there. And ask anybody with schizophrenia. When their mind is clear, they want help. If you could offer them a cure right now, they would take it. They would absolutely take it. Anyhow, some other features of schizophrenia. There's an aging component. So there's two different forms to this. The first one is as schizophrenics become elderly, as they get elderly, you tend to see the positive symptoms disappear. So the delusions and hallucinations, they dampen, they go down. The loose associations and negative symptomology comes to the forefront. It's just this world of flat affect and withdrawal and no emotions. The second defining feature that has to do with age is the fact that the majority of schizophrenia emerges in late adolescence. So usually 18 years old, 20, if you get past 25, maybe 30 without getting schizophrenia, then the chances of you getting it is you virtually have no chance of ever having it. It's a disease of adolescent onset. And this is going to fit with two things we'll be talking about. One is the epidemiological evidence showing that schizophrenia has a psychological aspect where it is a response to major stressors. These are individuals who have always been a little bit odd, who in elementary school, they had imaginary playmates far later than most other kids, usually imaginary friends in around 6, 7 years old. And so these are kids who have had imaginary friends way later than that. And they have had all sorts of periods where they seemed to not be paying attention, lost in their own thoughts. They had trouble making friends, but they were okay. They weren't crazy. They were sort of hanging on. And then it was late in high school when they had a car accident, or the first boyfriend was so horrible to them, or their parent died, or whatever the crisis was. And this person who is just sort of holding on, and that's where the dip occurs. And that's where it crashes and schizophrenia appears. So this is an late adolescent onset where stress plays a major precipitating role. The other piece that we'll see is the fact that schizophrenia is heavily anchored in the frontal cortex. Remember the frontal cortex, which is not fully mature until age 25 or so. The last big burst of frontal maturation it happens in late adolescence or early adulthood, and we'll see that there's lots of reasons to think that schizophrenia is a disease where around late adolescence a fragile, vulnerable, traumatized frontal cortex gets kicked once too hard with something or other, and that's where the problems emerge. A couple of other features: demography. In every culture ever looked at on Earth, 1 to 2% of the population comes down with schizophrenia. No gender differences, no social economic status differences in terms of who becomes schizophrenic. But once you are, there's obviously there's a downward socioeconomic spiral, which is no surprise. People who are schizophrenic do not make very good CEOs of large corporations. They don't handle money well. These are street people. These are the homeless. The majority of people living on the streets in this country are individuals who are schizophrenic, not alcoholic. Not drug users, and that is the far more common thing that you see. So a disease of complete collapse into some of the least cared for sort of strata of society. That is part of the demographics of schizophrenia as well.